The Estoppel Certificate may be one of the most important documents when buying a tenant-occupied property, and we're going to run through a PDF version right now. This is an important topic for tenants and landlords. This is an important topic for buyers of tenant-occupied properties and sellers of tenant-occupied properties. And make sure you stick around to the end where we talk about what to do about a tenant who's not paying rent, how to document that, and advice on if the tenant won't sign the Tenant Estoppel Certificate. Hey there, Christian Walsh with Wire Associates. We're real estate agents based in Southern California, helping tenants and landlords and buyers and sellers during these crazy days in California and beyond. And this is a big update, an important topic on the Tenant Estoppel Certificate. This is necessary in any sale of a tenant-occupied property, whether there's one tenant or there's 100 tenants. You need to make sure as the buyer that you review the Tenant Estoppel Certificates. And remember, we can't give tax or legal advice, but for the most honest and up-to-date real estate advice you need, subscribe to this channel. So what is the estoppel in real estate? What does the estoppel mean? So the estoppel is a certificate. It's a form that is filled out between the tenant and landlord, and it goes over the high points of the lease. It covers things like the security deposit, how much the monthly rent is, when the last time the rent was paid, who pays for what utilities, who the appliances belong to, and a few other things. It's very important when a property is under contract, any rental property, it's important that the landlord gets this filled out by the tenant and that the buyer of the property reviews it. What it does is it provides confirmation of the terms of the rental agreement, and it protects both the tenant and the landlord. Why is the tenant estoppel so important? Well, there's a few different reasons, especially in cases where tenants have been in place for a while. A landlord may not have all the documents they need. So maybe the lease is gone, maybe some of the rental increases and other notices are gone as well. So you can use the tenant estoppel to cast in stone the terms of the tenancy right now. Even if a landlord has all of these documents and is very organized, or the tenant just moved in, this still gives a way for the tenant to confirm the details of the lease and prevent any misunderstandings down the road. So if you're ready to dive into a sample Tenant Estoppel Certificate, hit that like button and we'll get started. So let's get the party started on the Tenant Estoppel Certificate. I know this is not exciting, but it's very important. Like I said, this may be one of the most important forms in the deal. It's important you take a look at this one. Now, you don't have to use this one specifically. This is from the California Association of Realtors. Other apartment associations will have this. Wherever you are in the United States, you'll be able to find a form to be able to use like this. One important thing I want to point out is it hasn't actually been revised for a while. So you can see this is a 10-year-old form. The last time it was changed was 2011. So apparently not much has changed in the world of estoppels. So that's another little thing to point out. So let's dive in. So there's a lot of lines in here. We're not going to look at every single one in depth. We're going to hit the high points, the most important ones. So obviously we want to put the tenant name and the premises, the rental property. That's what goes up at the top. Then we dive into the important stuff. So this box you can check. You can actually attach a copy of the most recent lease. If you don't attach a copy, it's okay. It doesn't change the validity of this form. It's just, it gives you the option in this case. So you're gonna put the date of the lease. If you don't have the lease anymore, then you don't put anything on this line. The name of the current landlord, name of the current tenant, that's obvious stuff. The current monthly rent, which is a very important one. If you have an old lease with an old dollar amount and you don't have all the most recent notices that show the increases, this is what we're going to use to determine the actual rent, and the tenant is going to sign and verify. So another important thing is it says paid through. So paid through is important. If this form goes out in the middle of the month, for example, we're shooting this in August, so if the tenant had paid the rent, so this form would say that the tenant has paid the rent through August 31st if they paid August rent. So that's important that you put that on there. Where this is also important, if the tenant hasn't paid the rent, if they're behind because of COVID, whatever reason, you're not going to put anything on this line because they haven't paid. So that is very important. That's where we're going to document at least non-payment of rent. We're going to partially document there. And then later on, we're going to add some more to that. So then the security deposit. I can't tell you how important this one is. Get the security deposit on there. It says other deposits. I just put everything into the security deposit that the landlord actually took. So if they took a security plus a cleaning deposit and key deposit, roll it into one and put it on this line. And this is also important because if for whatever reason the tenant thinks they gave $2,000, the landlord thinks only $1,000, this is the time to hash it out when the deal's under contract, not after it's closed and the landlord's attempting to pay a deposit and then it's a new owner and you're fighting. So I've actually been in that situation. Had we had the tenant estoppel certificates, we would have known going in what the actual security deposit is. So trust me, I'm a big proponent. I've learned my lesson that every deal where there's a tenant, whether it's one tenant or 100, you need the tenant estoppel certificate. So the expiration of the current term. So that would be if they're on a lease and their lease expires in a few months, you'd fill this out. If they're month to month, I just put month to month in that line. Parking spaces, storage spaces, if they have extra spaces there, you could document that there. Now J and K are utilities and appliances. Who pays for which utilities? Again, this is very important. If the landlord pays for all the utilities or the tenant pays or they're split, this is where it's documented. And then the appliances, it's not always obvious who owns certain appliances. So this is where it would be documented as well. And I'll tell you what's very common with appliances, if a tenant has been there a long time, like 20 years, they may own all of the appliances because some landlords just gave up on replacing and said, hey, you go buy it. So this would be important for a new owner, a new landlord to know when the tenant moves out, if they're going to take every appliance, they need to know, the new owner needs to know. So that's where it's stipulated here. So line 2 is basically some blank lines where if there's anything special about the arrangement of the lease, anything special that there is that the tenant and landlord have would go on this line. So this could be if the tenant mows the lawn and gets $25 off their rent, things like that. That would go on this line. Anything that the tenant would want to make sure the new owner knows would go on these lines. And if there's nothing there, then what it says underneath is that if it's not here, then there's no other agreements out there that are atypical, that are verbal or written on paper somewhere else. So it's important that anything special go on these lines. There's some boilerplate language. We won't dive into that. If you want to look at it, reach out to me for a sample of this and I can send you a sample. But the next important line to me is line 5, and that's what it says, tenants not be given any free rent, partial rent, etc., rent concessions, etc. This is where I would document if a tenant is behind on rent. So the number of months of rent the tenant is behind should be documented here based on the date of signing. And if the landlord's received any rental assistance, I would document it here. The other thing, going back to the security deposit, if a landlord has in writing that the tenant is giving up their security deposit to use for rent, I would put it here and I'd make sure it's marked 0 for security deposit at the top. So that's where we're going to straighten out things like that. The fact that the tenant's not paying rent should be disclosed in other places as well. And we have our clients disclose it on some of the other statewide forms we have, but this would be the other important spot. So then you will have the tenant sign. Now technically what it says is that if one tenant signs that it's sufficient for all the tenants, but you're going to want to get as many of the tenants on the lease as possible to sign on these lines and verify the information. And then of course the landlord or the manager are going to sign as well. Now, big question is who should fill this out? And typically what I do to make it easy is when I'm the listing agent, I'll fill this out based on the information that I find in the leases. Then if there's anything that needs to be changed that the tenant reviews and says isn't accurate, they can either fill out a new one or they can make that change and initial next to it. So that's how we handle the tenant estoppel certificate. The other important thing, the other big question is, what if the tenant won't sign this? Really, honestly, it protects the tenant, so they should want to review and sign it. But we're going to show you one more important thing that you should have. So you have a rock solid lease that addresses what happens if a tenant doesn't sign the estoppel, right? The sad thing is most landlords don't, but we're going to show you in the Standard California Association of Realtors residential lease, it does address that. And you'll see the estoppel is about 10 years old, but the lease is much younger. That's revised repeatedly, and I'll probably go through more revisions. But keep on scrolling through. This lease is incredibly thorough, and I know a lot of landlords don't bother to update their leases. This lease that the California Association of Realtors has and many apartment associations have, it includes all these important things. But way down here, number 33, I want to show you because it addresses what happens if a tenant won't sign the estoppel. So this is important to make sure it's in your lease. In fact, if you've got tenants who are month to month, or a lease is coming due, it's time for a new rental agreement that covers everything that's required by law and covers stuff such as what happens with tenant estoppels. So what it says here is the tenant shall execute and return the tenant estoppel certificate delivered to the tenant by the landlord. They have 3 days to review it and sign it. If they don't do it within 3 days, the lease says that whatever's on that estoppel, the tenant is automatically agreeing to. So it's very important, and that tenant estoppel certificate is a legal binding document that could be used to prove rent, security deposit, anything else that's been filled out. So this, again, we would like to see in all your rental agreements. Make sure you address the tenant estoppel because you never know when you're going to want to sell. Make sure you address what happens if a tenant won't sign it. What other questions do you have about the tenant estoppel certificate? Leave those in the comments below. We'd also love to have you join over 1,000 others who've subscribed to our free weekly email newsletter. Comes out on Sundays. We have a link below, or you can text newsletter to 949-691-3566. This covers topics like what you're watching now, plus a whole lot more for tenants and landlords and buyers and sellers. This has been Christian Walsh, real estate agent with Wire Associates, and we appreciate you.